Welcome to McGill Library's Systematic and Scoping Review Workshop for Social Sciences and Education. My name is Emily Kingsland, and I'm a librarian at McGill University. This is Part 1, Background Information. So first of all, many students ask, what is a systematic review? A systematic review attempts to gather all of the empirical evidence that fits pre-specified eligibility criteria to answer a specific research question. The parts I want to highlight here are the pre-specified eligibility criteria. With systematic reviews, you have a research question and you also have your criteria that you want to define upfront. It uses systematic methods that are selected with a view to minimizing bias, thus providing more reliable findings from which conclusions can be drawn and decisions can be made. Here are some examples of eligibility criteria. Study design. For example, you may wish to focus on randomized control trials or case control studies, for example. Publication type. Perhaps you only wish to include peer-reviewed journal articles, conference proceedings, and dissertations and theses, for example. Language. You may only be able to read articles and English and French, so you would limit to those languages. Publication date. It is rare that we see a limit by publication date in systematic or scoping reviews, but sometimes it's necessary if you can provide a solid reason for doing so. An example would be that a landmark study came out in a specific year that completely changed the way we understand a topic. Or perhaps you're interested in a specific kind of technology and older articles would simply be out of date. Geographic location. You may wish to narrow down to articles focused on a specific area, such as South America only. Age. You can specify which age ranges you want to focus on, such as school-aged children from ages 5 to 17. Gender. For gender, you can state if you wish to focus on a specific gender or include all genders. With race and/or ethnicity, you may wish to focus your review on a specific racial or ethnic group. Medical conditions. You could focus on specific diseases or conditions that are relevant to your review question, such as individuals with autism. Severity of condition. You can limit by the severity or the stage of the condition. Comorbidities. You could choose to either include or exclude studies based on the presence of other medical conditions. Type of intervention. Lastly, you can narrow your focus to a certain type of intervention, such as a specific type of therapy. So these are just some examples of eligibility criteria. You can be as broad or as specific as you wish to be. Now, it's really important to make the distinction between a systematic review versus a literature review. There are a few things I want to highlight here. The first is the research question. A systematic review always needs to have a very specific research question. Often, a systematic review's research question can be answered with a yes or a no. Versus, if you're doing a literature review, your research question can be broad, it can be specific, it's really up to you. Systematic reviews must have something that is called a protocol. We'll be discussing what a protocol is later in this video series. Reporting. For a systematic review, reporting must be explicit. What we mean by reporting is stating exactly which databases you searched, the days that you searched those databases, and sharing your search strategies in these databases. This makes your search replicable. This way, the reader can then go ahead and rerun these searches for themselves. It is mandatory to share at least one of your database search strategies when you're publishing a systematic review. It could be encouraged if you're doing a lit review, but usually it's not mandatory. The scope. So this is another defining criteria of a systematic review. The scope has to be defined upfront. So when we say scope, we're talking once again about our inclusion or our exclusion criteria. And as you'll recall, we looked at examples of eligibility criteria on the previous slide. However, when it comes to conducting a literature review, This could be a very iterative process. You may not know upfront what your criteria is. And as you begin to identify articles during the process of your lit review, you may decide to focus your research on a specific area. So that's the main difference between systematic reviews and lit reviews. With lit reviews, you can figure it out as you go along, whereas with the systematic review, you've got to have all of this defined upfront. Now, of course, when it comes to bias, of course, we're always striving to minimize bias. But with the systematic review, in the methodology for how you conduct them, there's a lot of things that are built into the process of conducting a systematic review that really helps us minimize the bias as much as possible. We'll be discussing this later in the workshop, but a quick example of a way that systematic reviews minimize bias is by having, as a bare minimum, at least 2 co-authors. Whereas with a lit review, for example, you can publish with just one author. Another important facet of systematic reviews is that most journals strongly encourage you, or sometimes make it mandatory, that you have your search strategy peer-reviewed. What this means is that a peer, so someone who's an expert in your field of research, and who has ideally published at least one systematic or scoping review before, they look at your search strategy and they evaluate it, they critically appraise it, they peer review it. So the peer reviewer might tell you, oh, you know what? You've forgotten some keywords. I would consider adding these. They might say your search is too broad or your search is too specific. They give you feedback. And then it's up to you to incorporate that feedback into your search strategy before you move forward. We'll talk more about the peer review process later in the workshop. Critical appraisal and synthesis are important features of the systematic review, and we'll be dealing with these in later parts of the workshop as well. Then when it comes to time, so when you're conducting a systematic review, on average, it can take several months to up to even a year from the time you start working on your systematic review to this time that you submit it to a journal for publication. This is rare when it comes to lit reviews. With lit reviews, it really depends on the scope of your project, how much time you have to devote to it, and so on. So it could take several weeks or a few months, depending. So really, the timeline is very different when it comes to these 2 types of reviews. So now that we've talked about systematic reviews, the next question is, what is a scoping review? So a scoping review aims to address broader, more complex, and exploratory research questions to better understand phenomena and evaluate where research has or has not been completed. So if we were to compare a scoping review to a systematic review, often it's the research question that is being posed that helps us figure out whether it's scoping or systematic. We'll talk about this in a minute. It uses rigorous methods to describe the literature in the field, its volume and characteristics to determine gaps in the literature. So let's compare them side by side now. Systematic reviews and scoping reviews. What's the difference? So as I said before, systematic reviews, the search question is normally very focused, very specific, compared to the scoping review, where the research question is often quite broad. You'll note, though, when it comes to conducting the systematic or the scoping review, when it comes to building the search and applying the methodology, in both cases, both of these are equally systematic and transparent. They're both considered original research publications, and they're both considered scholarly and academic research. There isn't one that is better, quote unquote, than the other. What it really boils down to is your research question. And if we skip to the bottom of this chart for a moment, we can look at the synthesis. So often systematic reviews deal with quantitative questions, questions of a quantitative nature, versus scoping reviews tend to be qualitative in nature. So if you have a research question that's quite broad and qualitative, odds are you're conducting a scoping review. If your research question is very focused and quantitative in nature, odds are you're writing a systematic review. Once again, the criteria. So your search criteria, your inclusion and exclusion criteria must be defined upfront when you're conducting a systematic review. So you must have your criteria in place before you start building your searches and running those searches in different databases. Whereas with the scoping review, kind of like a lit review, it's much more flexible. Because with the scoping review, you're aiming to address broader issues and you're trying to identify gaps or trends in the literature. And sometimes you don't know what those gaps or trends are until you're in the midst of conducting your scoping review. So, as such, your search criteria is something that you can amend as you go with a scoping review. Once again, there is an important critical appraisal step that is incorporated into systematic reviews that rarely shows up in scoping reviews. And again, we're going to talk about this later on in the workshop. So these are the important distinctions between systematic and scoping reviews. Now, while this workshop is focused on these types of reviews, we're also going to quickly chat about meta-analyses. So what is a meta-analysis? A meta-analysis is a statistical procedure for combining data from multiple studies. They help determine whether an intervention works or does not. They can also help determine which intervention works best. So some students who are conducting a systematic review might ask themselves if they want to conduct a meta-analysis as well. And indeed, a meta-analysis can be conducted as a next step following a systematic review. So how does this work? Well, firstly, studies from the systematic review are selected for inclusion in the meta-analysis. The data and/or the outcomes are extracted from each study. Summary measures are calculated for further analysis. And then a model to compare different effect sizes across different studies is applied. And lastly, the results are graphically reported in a forest plot. So like I said, this workshop focuses on systematic and scoping reviews, but this is just a quick overview of what a meta-analysis is. Okay, so it is quiz time right now. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask you a series of true or false questions, and based on what you've learned today, you're going to test yourself. So, true or false? Systematic reviews generally have very specific research questions. True or false? I'll give you a moment to think. It's true. All right, next one. True or false? Scoping reviews tend to be quantitative. Again, true or false? Scoping reviews tend to be quantitative. False. Scoping reviews actually tend to be qualitative in nature. It's systematic reviews that are more quantitative. True or false? The inclusion and exclusion criteria for scoping reviews are defined upfront. Again, the inclusion and exclusion criteria for scoping reviews are defined upfront. False. They were only defined upfront for systematic reviews. Scoping reviews are more similar to literature reviews in that way. You can amend your criteria as you go along. Okay, now here's another kind of quiz. In this instance, I'm going to show you 4 research questions. And based on what you've learned today, you're going to test yourself to see whether this research question is a systematic review or a scoping review. So here's our first research question. Can programs delivered in school prevent young people from starting to smoke? Again, is this a systematic review or is it a scoping review? This is a systematic review. So you may recall earlier, we said that oftentimes systematic reviews can be answered with a simple yes or no. So this is a clear example of that. Can programs delivered in school prevent young people from starting to smoke? The answer may be yes, it may be no. All right, here's number 2. What do we know about the sporting experiences of gender and sexual minority athletes and coaches? Is this a systematic review or is this a scoping review? Again, what do we know about the sporting experiences of gender and sexual minority athletes and coaches? This is a scoping review. So that's a broad research question. When you're asking something that begins with what do we know about a certain phenomena, often that's a sign that it's a scoping review. Here's our third research question. What is known from the existing literature about the association between depression and the use of social media among adolescents? Is this a systematic review or a scoping review? Again, the question is, what is known from the existing literature about the association between depression and the use of social media among adolescents? I know this one is tricky, but it's a scoping review. So when we're asking ourselves what is known in the literature, that's a sign that it's scoping. Also, in this case, what is known in the literature about the association between depression and social media? That's broad. There's no yes or no answer here. It's a scoping review. All right, here's our fourth and final research question. How accurate are tools for diagnosing autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, in preschool children? Is this a systematic review or a scoping review? Again, the question is, how accurate are tools for diagnosing autism spectrum disorder, ASD, in preschool children? So this is a systematic review. It's looking at the accuracy of tools for diagnosing autism in a specific population. It will be able to answer definitively whether the tools we use are accurate or not, and the degree to which they may or may not be accurate. So it's a systematic review. All right, so now we've reached the end of part 1 of our workshop. Please join us for part 2, where we discuss sensitivity versus precision. I hope to see you there.